This artifact is known as an ice tong. An ice tong's main job was in ice harvesting. And through that job, it gives us a wonderful window back in time to when ice harvesting was done, and as a byproduct, into refrigeration, as they are very deeply connected. To understand how ice harvesting was done by proxy, how the history of refrigeration was made, one first must understand the tools used in ice harvesting. The main one were, of course, the saws. These saws had to be super long because they had to cut through anywhere from 15, 20 inches of ice. So they had to be long and sharp to be able to make sure they could do that. Now, later on, they were replaced by power saws and by other mechanical saws, and that was in line with the time of technology. However, for the most of ice harvesting history, it was used by hand saws. Next were ice plows. Ice plows were used to make indents in the ice so that ice blocks could be chopped out easier and usually with less of a mess and chance of breaking. Now, later on, they were pulled by horses, but early on, they were used just by hand. After that were chisels. Chisels weren't as commonly used, but they were sometimes used instead of saws to cut the ice into long sheets so they could then be cut by the saws. They came in many sizes, but usually the ends were spiked on them. And one of the last tools were pike poles. Pike poles were long poles with hooks on the end. These were used to draw the ice to the side so that it could be put back on land and then be transported. These ranged anywhere from like 10 feet to the size of a pike. So these were usually long and required a lot of arm strength to be able to use effectively. To understand the history of refrigeration, one first must understand the history of ice harvesting. Ice harvesting was normally done by first finding a frozen body of water, whether that be a frozen lake, river, reservoir, and then they would usually get a core sample with a drill, trying to aim for a thickness of anywhere from 15 to 20 inches thick. And if they found that, they would make small indents into the ice in a grid pattern so they could just easily break out the ice blocks and then tow them to shore. Now, early on, the cutting of the ice was done by hand saws and human hands. Later on, an ice plow was invented, and then later on, a special method for horses and other pack animals to draw the ice plow was invented. And these were used for many years to cut out giant ice blocks that were usually 22 inches square and weighed anywhere from 200 to 300 pounds each. Using poles and smaller ice picks, they would pull these blocks up from the water, and then pushing and using pulley systems and sleds, they would pull these ice blocks onto carriages and carts to then be hauled off to the ice houses waiting further on beyond. Now that we understand how ice harvesting was done, we can understand a little bit more of the history of refrigeration. For this, we now go to the grandfather of modern refrigerators, known as the ice house. Ice houses were usually more akin to bunkers, usually being underground, in a hill, or in the shade. These were small pits, usually with stone or mud walls, that had insulation of sawdust or straw, and were used to house the ice that was harvested from ponds or rivers. They were stored in these places until they could be later used, usually stored throughout the winter and then used throughout the spring and summer. Now, after the ice houses, a smaller form and the dad of refrigerators was invented. These were referred to as ice boxes. Ice boxes were wooden or metal and had a small compartment in the top where small blocks of ice, usually a few inches wide and not that tall, would sit, and the cold air from them would flow down onto the food and preservatives, making it an early refrigerator. However, these ice boxes did have the problem of their doors were more similar to cabinets for the most part, making it so they did not trap in the cold very well. And you needed to refill ice, necessitating ice transportation. These were done through ice trucks, as can be seen here. These ice trucks would go around town and deliver ice blocks that would then be cut and put into these ice boxes to refrigerate food as needed. However, cars and trucks were not the only transportation methods used by this newfound ice empire. There were even rail cars used for a lot of the time, bringing ice blocks in and out of towns and cities. Eventually, in 1867, the first refrigerated rail car was invented. This marked the beginning of the end for the ice empire. However, it wasn't until 1913 that it was officially done. This was the first time an electric refrigerator was widely sold, and the American public no longer needed the icebox and its subsequent variants. In conclusion, even though this artifact and the information story it has to tell don't seem important, the history of refrigeration is massively important for the rise of humanity, as without it, we wouldn't be able to preserve food as long, we wouldn't be able to do as much international trade as we do. It would change our daily lives and the world as we know it if it didn't come to be. And it all started with ice harvesting that was accomplished through the use of this ice tong